the opportunity through our presenter to learn a little bit about the study that had been commissioned to discover then the perceptions of law enforcement. And so, as you were listening to the presentation that was provided to you, prior to our discussion this evening, I'm interested in knowing, as a coach, an executive coach, one of the things that we often try to say is that there's 3 ways that we listen to things that trouble us, or things that need to be addressed. And you use your head, you use your heart, and you use your gut. In an effort to frame our conversation this evening, I'm interested in knowing your heart. Why are you here? What brings you to advocate on behalf of the disenfranchised or the racially profiled? And then what are your expectations for this event? What would you want to see happen in Wichita because of our gathering this evening? Who would like to kick us off?
Well, for me, this has been something that has been very important to me, close to my heart for the past 5 years, ever since Trayvon Martin was shot and killed. And my hope for this evening is to continue along the collaborative approach that we have been engaged in Wichita and trying to address this issue. Something that I didn't really hear too much about in the presentation was validating what minorities actually feel up towards police. I did hear Dr. Berger mention it, but from an officer's perspective, especially from a white officer's perspective, I was wondering, how many of them have actually would have said, yes, I believe that this is a problem for African Americans because of what has happened historically. So my hope is to have some semblance of validation of what minority communities feel towards police, because that's the only real way that we can actually move towards a resolution, is by acknowledging that those feelings are actually valid. It isn't something that we're just making up, based off, what we see on the news. These things happen, and 9 times out of 10, you don't always see them on the news. So that's part of my hope for this evening.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being here. For me, it is deeply in my heart, and it's a little bit complicated because my community is also divided, for the Latino community, between the ones that are citizens and the ones that are undocumented, which is a very sensitive subject where I was paying a lot of attention to the presentation, and it talks a lot about education, but it is always the minorities who they recommend to be educated. And I think we really need to also change a little bit the subject and put our stories on the table. And I would love to see training with the police department and the sheriff department especially from the community to them. And a training where they can listen to our stories. Because they're doing such a great job with their academy, the Citizen Academy and stuff, in trying to educate us, but I think everybody needs to be educated.
Well, I am here tonight because I was a target of racial profiling. I have experienced it. I've lived it. I know people who have been a victim of racial profiling. And for me tonight, I hope that the message comes across that this is real. It does happen. It does happen here in Wichita. It has happened in Wichita, and that we are open to other perspectives, like truly open, really listening, not listening to respond, but listen and understand that some people do go through this, and we need to work together to end it. And that comes from, like the presentation showed, working together, having those positive interactions, but more so understanding what bias is, admitting when we do have bias, and then working through that. If we don't admit our personal biases, we won't have progress. We'll just acknowledge that, yes, that's a problem, it's not here, and we'll try to get past it or tell people to ignore it or forget it. And that's not the way to success. That's why we're here now. We always tell people of color to ignore it or move on or forget it. but those things continue to happen, and then we're told that it's some legitimate reason. And one of the funny things from the readout was the officer that kind of said, well, part of it was just the generational part, but that they felt like it was a negative thing, but most of that that's passed down comes from watching actual experiences. Like for me, I was told some of the things that were in the PowerPoint, but I watched officers do things to Black people. Like that was my personal experience. It didn't have anything to do with my parents. It was from what I saw. So those things need to be acknowledged and talked about. Conversations like this really have to hit the root issue, and we have to be willing to have those. I've seen a few conversations like this that kind of stay surface level, but until we get to the root issue, we don't make progress, and I hope tonight we can make some progress.
Well, I have, since entering police work in the early 90s, I've always had a sincere interest in race relations, and I'm passionate about the role that police play in society. And I think, we all recognize that there's been policing tactics, some that have been well-intended, that have had unintended consequences. There's issues today that we recognize the issues of how poverty plays into, fine amounts. What a $150 traffic ticket means for someone who is making $70,000, $80,000 a year versus someone who's making minimum wage and maybe a single parent trying to pay their bills. And how really issues around driver's licenses and how easy they are to be lost and how hard they are to get back, how that impacts people that are trying to get by, and their relationship with the police and their trust with others. Issues like discretion that we're talking a lot about at the police department, the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law, and how important discretion is in what we do, and to recognize these issues about fine amounts and how it can impact people trying to get by. Fortunately, I had those discussions and I had good mentors that shared with me the importance of that, but we've got work to do because in hiring officers, and one of the things I like to do is I like to hire people with life experience and maybe had adversity, faced adversity in their life, that have struggled to understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. How people that have had adversity make better police officers because they can relate better to what they deal with out there and that $150 ticket and how that impacts them. So, I think the formula for good policing with the community is there, but there's issues such as staffing, training, costs, lack of staffing that play into that ultimately hurt our ability to do the community policing and that proactive outreach and build those relationships that is so important in what we do. So it's not always as easy as it may seem because a lot of times it's tied to financial restrictions. But I am passionate about being part of the solution. And if someone feels that the community feels, or certain members feel that the police department is mistreating a segment of the community, it's my role as chief to listen and to be part of the solution. Whether it's everybody's opinion, if someone feels their reality, their perception is their reality. So I am committed to building relationships and doing everything I can do as chief of police to make sure that the community knows that they get stopped by the police or have an issue, that they are going to be treated fairly, which is the foundation of what our country is about.
I think I won't take too much time just for the answer. You said why we are here. For me personally, I think, I want to put everybody at ease, Chief, the gentleman over there. I think the Muslims, we just took the role of everybody else in this ship here. Dr. Berger, you need a new study. And just imagine being a Muslim and then African American, and also we have Latino that's dark skin, so you just got all the things. But anyhow, for me tonight to come out, it really starts like this in these kind of settings and panels to educate each other. Yes, a wound did happen at some time through this country. And I'm telling you, this is not only here in this country, being born in a foreign country, in Kuwait, when they come in here young, it's the same issue with the police and even people within the same race. that scare and that intimidation there from the police towards the community is also there. That needs a lot of work between both parties, the community itself and the people in authority. And definitely, the study is absolutely, and we feel it as being Muslim, media has a lot to do also with the issue. That sometimes exaggerates for one bad thing and wipes everything else that is good that somebody take, for example, the police force that might do good, or even Muslims that might do good at large, and then something gets wiped out by one bad apple or one bad thing. So we need to all, as a community, and all these that were mentioned in the study, to come together. Media, African Americans, police, and everybody else, Latinos, all the minorities really, and as well as definitely the majority, if it's the white group, then have to come also on the table and be some kind of standards that we all can agree on and go on together.
Thank you. So to pick up on a few of the things that I noted in your comments, I was particularly struck by the comments that were made by the officers with regard to proactive policing and how that is used in an effort to provide a better service to our communities. Yet, when we think about survival instincts that are taught in families, perhaps, or in communities, they aren't being proactive, or it's being perceived as negative. What are your recommendations then for beginning a conversation simply there in thinking about the bias, thinking about the difference in how we're describing the different roles that each play in the issue of racial profiling?
Well, Chief kind of touched on it. A lot of these are the endpoint to larger societal and social issues. 67214 is a prime example. 67214 is an area that has a higher crime rate. However, it also has a 56% unemployment rate. It has one of the highest high school dropout rates. It has the highest infant mortality rate in the country. And so when you have all of those societal things that are commingled with proactive policing, you end up with problems, and you end up, again, because of the generational aspect of it, you end up with people who have a perception that the police is more of an occupying force as opposed to being a part of the community.
So what would you pose then as a next step in order to bridge that gap?
Well, one of the things that we could do is kind of what we've tried to do during this legislative session, which is have police officers begin to talk about these issues with legislators, because they don't like to listen to us when we go and talk to them about these issues. So, but they do like to listen to the police. Ed Clump, if y'all know who Ed Clump is, you need to know who he is. Ed Clump gets everything he wants when he goes to the legislature. So what we have to do as a society, is have our police officers begin to talk about these issues. Have the police begin to talk about Medicaid expansion. That's something that's important. It's because you also have police officers that are dealing with untreated mental illness. So talk about how that makes an impact on the police force. Again, infant mortality. Have police begin to talk about these things and how they are impacting the department. So that we can try to get some legislation, some ordinances, we can get some movement from the county. We have to have law enforcement join with us in talking about these societal issues.
For me, I would say, just bringing it back to the law enforcement and community, maybe at the time of the stop, I would say openness and transparency, and that's something that I know Chief Ramsey has been pushing for. But if you tell me why I'm pulled over, and if it's a pretext stop, then there's an investigation going on. Maybe you can't get into detail about the investigation, but Dollar General was robbed, there was a red car, driving a red car, tail light was out, my tail light's out, and you can describe why I'm being pulled over, and it really makes sense. I'm probably not going to think I'm being racially profiled. We can have that conversation, but if you just pull me over and tell me my tail light's out and nothing else, I was going the speed limit, you really couldn't tell because you weren't behind me too long, and after that, you kind of get a little attitude with me, and then you give me a ticket for it when you could have just said, hey, we had this situation going on and been open about it. That changes things. And I've had experiences with both. When I've been pulled over, an officer broke it down for me, I understood, I get it, hey, go get the bad guy. But if you're just gonna harass me, so the one time I got pulled over, an officer on 9th Street and Grove followed me for about half a mile, about 10 or 2 feet off of my bumper. And when I went over the dotted line, I get pulled over for reckless driving. Now, whose fault was that? It was on my bumper for half a mile. And then when I finally go over the deal, I get pulled over. And then the officer never gives me a reason outside of when I said, you were following real close behind me. Oh, you went over the dotted line? Yes, because you were behind me. And then I get a ticket and he goes off. No explanation or anything. So if an officer is transparent, they communicate effectively, I think that reduces a few things. But if not, then we keep having these problems.
Thank you.
I just want to give an example of proactive, especially here with the political climate and with the, kind of the pressure the American Muslims feel and everything. Police Department Chief Ramsey reached out to us. Everybody started becoming scared. They don't want to get out anymore. They're afraid of getting stopped. They're afraid of these raids that they see on TV. But when Chief Ramsey and a couple of the captains came over and addressed the congregation a couple of times, just put everybody at ease and said, well, okay, no, this is not the truth. That, again, media played a big role on that. It might not have been that big, but something was happening. But when they reached out and became proactive, it made a lot of difference in the community. Put everybody at ease. Know that as long as you follow the law and you abide by the law, you do that. And I agree with the gentleman. I'm sorry. That definitely, if the police explains when somebody's getting stopped, they will be able to put the person in their car at ease. I was talking to my older daughter coming here, talking to her about racial profiling. And she said, you've been racial profiled all the time. I said, how's that? She said, you get stopped every time you speed. I said, he couldn't even see me because I was speeding. So, but anyways, I think proactive is going to go a long ways. And it's always more important on the officers' shoulders to be the ones that start being proactive than the community itself, because they are the ones that's with authority on the
So that echoes the sentiment that was identified in the study, the positive interaction, the increased community policing, given the constraints that we have fiscally, the informal positive contacts that occur in communities, and I believe Candid recommended that's something that could benefit our community as well. As we discuss the last question, I want to make certain that you all are writing down your questions and sending them to the end of the aisle, and that we have someone circulating then to pick up those questions so that we can then share and discuss those questions.
Can I make a comment about that question?
Absolutely.
I think it's a little bit more complicated for the Latino community because, for example, I've been a member of the Hispanic Advisory Board with the police department for almost a year, and we're being with a lot of communication with Officer Ramsey, and they have done a tremendous effort to come up, even with the Spanish Facebook page but they're still, in the last couple of weeks, I've been talking a lot to my community, and there's still a lot of trust issues going on. And again, it comes where we have to deal with a lot of different things than everybody else. For example, no driver license, and a language problem, where, the officer can come and stop them and try to explain to them, but if one word gets off, they're not going to understand what they're doing. I have been listening to stories where they get pulled over and they think that it's just for the no driver license or because something minor, and then they don't understand the ticket, and then when they go to somebody who reads it to it, is something different than what they thought, and they never understood. So, there's a lot of issues. One of the other things that I noticed in this report is that everything is just like in one package, and I think like right now, every single department is policing very different. It's very different. My experience with the Wichita Police Department and what I'm trying to work with the Sheriff Department, for example, one of the biggest things, and I really want to mention that here, is last year, Officer Ramsey changed the vocabulary on the policies regarding immigrants, where they changed the term from illegal aliens to undocumented, and that was a huge step for us. That meant a lot for us, but that hasn't happened yet.
Dr. Berger at this point. You've heard comments from two different populations, our Islamic community as well as our Hispanic community and our undocumented population. Did any of those things come up? Any of those conversations?
No, they didn't in these two studies. Of course, I was commissioned specifically to look at racial minorities and primarily African American communities. So no, they did not. I should qualify that statement with, since the study, subsequent to the study, they've come up quite a bit when I give these talks.
Can I just touch on that too? Really what it's about is building a culture within the department of trust and transparency with the community. And specifically, some of the major issues right now that are at the forefront are use of force issues. And to let the community know what we are doing so that people that are concerned that the police may come to their home and someone may get hurt. First of all, you got to remember that we have millions of contacts every year. Our police department alone has millions of citizen contacts. We do hundreds of thousands of traffic stops, and the overwhelming majority of those go without any issues. We have done some things though since I've arrived as far as changing the way we do administer use of force, teach use of force, and communications. One of the first things that I implemented here was in-service training more on communication, de-escalation, not rushing into situations. We know that 60+% of officers of all shootings involve one officer. So making sure that officers have appropriate backup on the right calls. Ensuring that officers have tools other than deadly weapons. When I got into policing in the early 90s, I would have thought by today there would be some type of weapon available to police that could reliably incapacitate someone without killing them. It doesn't exist. Tools and growing tools, technology for us to use, such as less than lethal use of force. We recently introduced foam rounds that are high impact foam rounds that are less likely to kill someone than a bullet. Within 2 hours of deploying 4 of those a couple months ago, one was deployed on a veteran suffering from PTSD. And so he was stabbing himself in the neck with a knife, and it was dangerous for our officers to approach, but they deployed this tool, and it worked. It knocked him down, and they were able to swarm him and took him for help without him being injured. So the use of force, less than lethal, is very, very important in the direction we're going. And I'll tell you, one of the most proud moments that I've had is that one of the things we've changed in the last year on suicidal individuals, right? So it's always been odd to me that we would go on a suicide call and we would end up shooting the subject. So we started almost a year ago, the first call where we left the scene of an individual who was suicidal. There was no one in the home. Now obviously there's some liability with that, but I think that the expectations of the family would be they'd rather have that individual kill themselves than have the police kill them. There was no one else in the home, no one else in danger, so there was about 6 instances last year where we left those situations. On instances where someone is in a home with a weapon, may have a weapon, we're taking our time. We've tripled the number of hostage negotiators we have, or negotiators, on the department. So we talked about. We had an incident in September, October, where we had a male who had threatened his family with a gun. All the family got out. They were black. Mom was concerned we were going to kill her son. Sister was Facebooking it live. A lot of tension, a lot of emotions. So we talked for about 6 hours, and he eventually came out. Now, some of the leaders, some of the department members at the scene that were leading that said, you know what, we've changed now, Chief. We've changed because, you know what, a year ago we would have blown that door open. That would have been over 10 minutes. Could have got property damage. He could have been hurt. We could have been hurt. And instead, we talked. So, really focusing on using de-escalation tactics and slowing things down to recognize the sanctity of human life and reduce the number of injuries and potential issues for us.
Okay. I want to turn it over to the experts. I know that you have drafted some really, really pertinent questions. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. She's going to take a stab at reading those questions, and it will defer to the panel. Who would like to respond? I get to tell.
So we will get through just as many questions as we can. We do get quite a few, and they're all really, really good. So I will read the question, and then I will let Dr. Edwards kind of help us direct it to the panel as to who should best answer the question. So we'll probably go a little bit later than 9, to be really honest, just with the power outages and everything. So if you're watching the clock, that's just a heads up. But we want to get as much time as possible. So, a year ago, tensions between the Wichita Police Department and the community were high. Several protests occurred. So when the police department got word of these protests, or gets word of these protests, what do you all as a department do in order to de-escalate these high tensions and promote positive interactions between the police department and the community?
Well, so before I arrived here, I reached out to a few of the towns, right? So to build relationships ahead of time before there's a crisis, know who to call, who to talk to, and Juan and Brandon and I had built a relationship up prior to that, prior to those protests. And Juan, you can talk a little bit about the relationship, how things went down, but it's about building relationships, and policing is relational. We have to do a lot of outreach and work hard to build relationships before there's problems. And I think in this case, because we've done that work ahead of time, that we were able to turn the ship in the way that we did.
Yeah, one of the things that actually happened last year, obviously tensions were very high after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were murdered. The chief reached out to me because, I've been part of the group that has been responsive to not only those shootings that have happened nationally, but also shootings that have happened here locally. Because again, as Brandon said, this problem also happens here in Wichita. And the chief reached out to me and asked, do you want me to show up? And I told him, no, I don't want you to show up. It's not the right time. But he was doing that as a way to come out and try to say that I want to support the community. But, my view at that point in time was, no, the community wants to breathe. We need to get our frustrations out right now. It would be too tense. And if you saw on the news, if you paid attention at all last year, when you seen police officers show up to protest on skirmish lines, you saw officers with was it AK-47s or M16s or whatever, with assault rifles pointed at protesters. It just got out of hand. And so when we decided to protest, besides not being able to go onto the highway and shut the highway down, the highway patrol was the only law enforcement that showed up. Now, when WPD was present, the chief had called me on my phone, are you okay? Making sure we were all right. There were a couple of knuckleheads that showed up and tried to make things tense, and we were able to de-escalate those without police intervention. But the police stayed away, and things were safe. We were allowed to protest. We were allowed to walk up and down 13th Street freely. And so, again, but that goes back to building trust. Trust is something that takes a long time to build, but an instant for it to be taken away. And so, that's essentially what we did.
Thank you. At her presentation on the trust gap on February 16th, Dr. Janine Bell stated that soft policy solutions, such as positive interactions with police, don't work. She said that instead, law enforcement must end investigatory or pretextual stops. What is the the Wichita Police Department's stance on this, and why?
Well, if I understood that right, proactive relationships don't make a difference.
I believe that was the research she presented.
Yeah, my experience in 24 years of policing and working very closely throughout those 24 years with our communities of color has shown relationships make a difference, a big difference. As a matter of fact, I was at Southeast High this afternoon talking to a group of Black students, and we were talking about relationships. And the time that I got there, the time that I left, I could see the difference how relaxed the students were. We were laughing. A couple of them had even said during our interaction, in an hour's time, they had more interest in police and maybe we consider a career where they came in that interested. So Pretext stops. So, hey, we are supposed to deal with crime, right? So when I go to the neighborhood meetings, the big issue is do something about this crime. We're tired of it. So our job is to balance the relationship. So I talked about hotspot policing and how that, while in concept is very good and it's important that we have a presence where there are problem areas, where there's a lot of crime. People expect us to be there and they want us to be there. What's happened in these hotspot areas is that there has been, we haven't done the relationship in them. We haven't coordinated with the community on how to resolve crime issues. It's been the police go in, we are occupying, we are overbearing, and it's not been in concert with the community. And it has to be hand in hand with the community to resolve the issue. You can't just leave the police to do it alone. We got to partner with the community. We got to talk about good strategies to reduce the crime and work together to do it. It can't be one entity. But pretext stops, I believe that they do serve a role. It's important to recognize that the pretext stops, when I talk about the fine amounts and how they impact people, you got a hardworking single mom next to a drug house and she keeps getting caught up in the traffic stops. That becomes a precedent. And our officers need to know how that impacts people that live in those hotspots. And that's why it's important to have the relationships where they know that officers have worked with the community, where they're comfortable, the officers get to know people. That is how community policing is successful in reducing crime and avoiding issues with concerns over policing and racial profiling.
Chief, in building on that, we received a question that speaks directly to Dr. Bell's presentation also, where she stated specifically that there was no racial difference in the amount of tickets that would get written in communities, but there were tremendous differences or disparity in the number of pretext stops in the African American community. Can you speak to that?
Well, so we have, as I said, I want to be part of the solution. So we have been pulling our data on traffic stops and race in the last few months. We've been working with WSU. We want to dig down into this data and see what we can do to, why are these numbers that way? What can we do as a police department to ensure that we are not racially profiling? We're opening our books to research. We're letting people dig into it to help us be better. I can tell you that not too long ago, many police departments want nothing to do with anybody researching numbers. We're opening our books. We want to be as transparent as possible. We want to use facts and research to help us be better.
Can I give you one thing I think that is really important in trying to get at the root of this issue is David Duke, the ex-Grand Wizard of the KKK, does not consider himself to be a racist. You know, you have implicit bias, you have overt bias. 9 times out of 10, if you're going to ask a white officer if he's a racist, he's going to tell you, no, of course I'm not a racist. You know, so we have to be able to actually identify how these problems begin to exist. You know, and implicit bias is the type of bias that exists when you're unconscious that this may be a racist thing that you're doing. You know, until we start to have trainings that go beyond also a computer screen, because I mean, right now the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center is teaching people bias training on a computer. You know, I don't know how that works. You know, we have to have people involved who are directly impacted by these issues involved in that training. You know, so people from the community be involved in that training so that officers, particularly white officers, can have a better understanding and perspective from a person of color, from a person who's directly impacted. That's another way that we can move forward.
Yeah, and the pretext stops also, we have to take into consideration, again, going to the undocumented community, that one of those stops can separate a family. Because once they find out they don't have a driver license, you know, everything goes from there, and the immigration comes, puts a hold on them, and a family is separated. And I have something else in my well, another thing that I agree with Duan in the Latino community is that a lot of the times that we talk about racial profiling in our community with other members, and they kind of like, well, no, but I'm not, like you say, I'm not racist, I'm married to a black person, or, you know, I'm married to an Asian, or I have friends. But I've noticed that there's a big discrimination when there's like a big accent or the people don't speak English. and I noticed that myself. I never experienced it with the police, but I go to a grocery store and I speak Spanish with my son the whole time, and I can see those long faces. And that's what I get from the community, that they tell me they experience that when they get stopped by a police, when they know that they cannot communicate, the voice or the intonation of the officer changes, and they start yelling at him. And I believe to my community is saying, because if you have had contact with a Latino, once a Latino family trusts you, they open their heart and their doors and they offer you tamales. So you know when they're saying that they're being mistreated, and other people come to me and say, oh no, but I know this officer, I know this person is with your child. Well, yeah, but guess what? I believe my community members because I know how they are.
Just to second that up with the one, and we need Chief Ramsey to take this consideration. The training has to come from people that are impacted. Like last year, the state wanted to train the police for Muslims, well, the sheriff departments in the counties, of all of the counties, and they invited John Boyle. He's the most person that hates a Muslim and showed them all as terrorists, period. So, you can't invite someone like that to train you. You need to speak with the source itself, whether the African American community, Latino community, Muslim community, whatever it is, to go to the source for training.
Thank you for that. How does the political climate in our state, as in the cutting of social programs, contribute to the crime rate and policing? How can the efforts of the police impact socioeconomic disparities that can lead to problems with the police? They were similar questions that we put together, so I hope that made sense.
All right. Well, I've begun to have this conversation with Chief Ramsey, with Mark Bennett, and also Sheriff Easter, particularly around Medicaid expansion. That was one of the big political hot topics that we see what happened with that. Thank Governor Brown back. But anyway, we see in having these conversations, Sheriff Easter will tell you there are almost 40% of the people that are in Cedric County Jail are suffering from mental illness. When they get out of jail, yes, they may have meds. It may take them a while for them to get on meds once they go to jail, but when they get out of jail, they're not on their meds. So that's now becoming a bigger strain on the Sheriff's Department and on the Police Department, who is now having to deal with people that have untreated mental illness. The same goes for the Police Department. Mental illness is something that is really, really a major problem. ComCare's had their funding cut well over 40% over the last 4 years, or 4 or 5 years. So there's a strain on services to be able to address this issue, which in effect causes problems. What happens when the police, as Chief Ramsey mentioned, before we got Chief Ramsey, there were a number of cases of people who were in a crisis situation. Police showed up and they ended up shooting and killing them. Obviously that serves no one. So having these sorts of conversations with police, and then having the police do the lobbying, having them be the ones that are calling our legislators and explaining to our legislators, how important it is for this issue to be addressed, because it's now becoming a public safety issue as opposed to being a public health issue. So we have to be novel in our approach in how we talk about these social issues and how they affect the police. Because again, the police have a lot of power when it comes to lobbying. I've seen things that they've been able to accomplish in this state when they are either for or against something. So let's try to use them to help some of these social issues. Right?
I guess specifically to the political piece, when you have candidates that don't show up to forums and talk to constituents, when you have elected officials in the House and Senate that don't reach out to constituents, don't even talk to their police department, when you come into a conversation with your ideology of not really believing in constituents and constituents of color, we don't make progress. And in this political climate right now, that's where we're at. We have elected officials that won't come talk to people. We have elected officials that won't listen to law enforcement. They just have their idea. We have elected officials that don't care about mental health. And I say that through action. their heart might be in the right place, but their action and their vote is not. So it's not helping people. So if you're not listening, you're not coming to talk to people, and you don't really know the problem, we're in a situation we're in right now. So we need, I guess, better elected officials. So I would say we need to get out and vote, find some candidates to run, and then we can see some changes.
Also on the immigration side, they're coming up with those new anti-immigration policies like 157 and 158, which just passed the Senate last week. Hopefully they don't get to the next level. But those, the ones that are required or that are threatening the local law enforcement on taking away some of the money that they get, federal money, if they don't follow the law or the bill that is coming up, which is enforcing, or they're like putting enforcing the immigration law onto local enforcement, which they don't have the training, they don't have the money, they don't have the time. And that also comes down to where I've been talking to some community members, and they are very afraid. They're all very confused. In matter of fact, I think immigration, like ICE officers, should have been part of this study, or maybe in a future study, because they treat us like crap. Really, I have been detained 2 times. I have been placed in those ice boxes. They they place us in those ice boxes where they treat us like meat or something, and it's horrible the way they treat us, and they're being locally enforcing the law, because they're over there in our streets knocking doors and like treating our people. And so one of the things that I feel really bad about it is that I've seen the efforts, like I mentioned earlier, with the Wichita Police Department on getting that trust in the community, but these new policies are not helping at all, because the community are very, very confused, to the point where they call me and they said immigration came to my door, but the police officers were with them. And I have to come up and say, okay, how were they dressing up? They're all confused. They don't know if they were sheriff, if they were like Wichita Police Department. It's very confusing, and it's just breaking all that groundwork that is being done in the last year in the community. So it's affected really bad in the Latino community.
The immigration issues with ICE and had a major impact on our ability to work with the Hispanic community. We've done a lot. We've been doing a lot of work. We've got a lot of great things going, but there is a tremendous amount of fear that police are going to be detaining people. We don't do immigration enforcement. We're not. The immigration system is broken, and we just talked about mental health and how that is put on the backs of police. There's no reliance on police to deal with mental health. That's a federal issue. There's 5,000 less mental health beds in Kansas today than there was 20 years ago. 5,000 less beds. So that's an issue that the police have to deal with. Now, they're trying to make us deal with immigration, but we rely on our Hispanic community to help us solve crime. And if they're worried that we're going to be checking everybody and shaking them down if they're here legally or not, no one's going to want to talk to us. So we are not in the immigration enforcement business. We have no training on it. We have no, and it hurts our relationship. You talk about racial profiling. Racial profiling is part of it. There was a bill before the Senate here that would encourage the state patrol to do immigration enforcement. And so when you talk about how politics are impacting us, we're going to get pulled in all different kinds of directions, and I get very worried. That's some of the things.
Are there any best practices or things they would be implementing right now to start bridging that gap with the Hispanic or
We've been doing a lot with the Hispanic community. We created an advisory board last year of business owners and legitimate people with legitimacy in the Hispanic community to advise me and our department on issues impacting the Hispanic community. We regularly talk about it. We created the Spanish Facebook page. We assigned an officer full-time to meet with the Hispanic community and address issues, complaint line in Spanish only. We've been created a Spanish Citizen Police Academy last year. It's a priority for us because of the fear in that.
How can the police blame the media when so many of these incidences are shown on citizen videos? We don't need the media to tell us what we're seeing. And in that vein, are there any formal efforts to educate our local media about the topic covered this evening?
I think most of the things that they were talking about, the media playing or like selecting the most interactions with the African American community, I will say that's more national. Because I want to say, with all the respect, that local media, it is still very white, especially TV and radio and newspaper. I'm sorry, they're still not represent our minorities locally. And I can say it at least from the Latino community. And I can set up an example. Last year, my son was a target of a racial action by a white woman, and it was the video, my son recorded it, and the video got viral. When the news covered that, one of the things that I noticed is that they covered the face of this person. While I believe that if something was made by an African American or a Latino, they would put the picture in a big screen. And I will say, and like I said, with all due respect, I think local media needs a lot of education from minorities especially, and we need more local coverage on minority issues.
The videos have been great. You know, all of our patrol officers now have video cameras. It's been fascinating to watch, both in my old job, right, here, we're pulling 40 to 50,000 videos a month. Frequently, we have complaints, people come down, my office is right next to internal affairs. We allow the subjects of the video to come in and watch it. And 9 times out of 10, they're leaving saying thank you, and many of the times they're embarrassed about what happened. Video is extremely helpful for us. We're resolving a lot of complaints. We're seeing a decrease in our complaints as well. And I welcome citizens, if they see police interacting and they're concerned about it, pull out the camera and report it. I would encourage it. The video cameras, no doubt, are very, very helpful.
So, Dr. Berger, we have 2 questions here that I think that it would be interesting for you to respond to. What about police intimidation or intimidation by fear on the citizens? And then for the panel, do you feel like white supremacy is normalized within our police institutions? So, both an issue of power. Would you like to?
Yeah, I think when you look at the dynamics, particularly looking at the traffic stop, there's already power dynamics in play. The police have the power and, much discretion within a simple traffic stop. And, so yeah, I think that does play a role in citizens' perceptions as well, because one of the things I found in the first study is that citizens in the emotional affective realm, that's one of the things they talked about, is that they were absolutely helpless during that encounter that they thought was unjust, and there was nothing that they could do about it.
Sure. You said, could you repeat the question about was white supremacy normalized?
Yes. Is white supremacy, do you feel that white supremacy is normalized within the public institutions?
Of course. I mean, the thing is with that's systemic racism. That's what we're trying to dismantle. So of course, white supremacy is normalized because, white supremacy is built into the very fabric of how this country was built. We have to be very honest about that. When we talk about particularly the immigrant community, we often forget where states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California came from. It was part of Mexico, so these are people that are indigenous to this country. These are not people who, need to go back to their country. They're in their country. White people are the ones that came over on boats. So, we have to be honest about these types of things. So yes, white supremacy is definitely something that is normalized throughout numerous institutions in this country. You know, we can look at the past election cycle and gain an idea of what happened when Donald Trump would only refer to Chicago, you know, as if all black people lived in a street in Chicago. You know, I wanted to hear something about, you know, what was going to happen for the African American community, not just what problems existed in the African American community. You know, when we talk about the immigrant community, you know, we hear things like they're rapists, they're murderers, and some of them are good people. It's like, yeah, some of them are good people, you know. That's not the type of approach that we should have when discussing these issues. So yes, I do firmly believe that white supremacy is something that we got to figure out.
I would also echo those sentiments. Looking just back in our history, black people were 3/5 of a person in the Constitution until that was ratified. And just real life examples when you look at just the privilege aspect. You know, you don't recognize privilege after you've had it for so long, but when you can walk into a church and kill 9 people and get Burger King afterwards and then go to jail, but you sell little cigarettes and you get choked to death because you're black. I mean, it's right there. It's blatant. You see it. Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Castile. I mean, just sitting in your car having it done legally. I mean, you see it. It's blatant. And media plays a role in it. I know some people record it, but social media showing that is just showing you the reality that we face. It's not an increase in anything. The news media plays a role in that as well, kind of to that question we had a little while ago, where you see criminalized pictures of black people when they do something. But when you see the white kids there in their, you know, graduation gowns with tassels, smiling with the family and stuff, and they just killed 10 people. So those are the types of things that we see, and again, it feeds back into supremacy and privilege.
Follow-up question?
Yeah, I think intimidation has a big play in the Latino community, where especially I've been listening to a lot of complaints with the sheriff department about even not in a traffic stop, but when they call the police for something and they'll come and the way they treat them and the way they ask for the documents and like, oh, where are your documents? You know, like, are you legal here? And in fact, we have tomorrow a meeting with the sheriff department at Oakland, being that Oakland is a very forgotten, underserved part of the community because it's still considered Wichita, but it's on the sheriff department jurisdiction, but then it's their school district. So when I try to reach out for help, it's very hard to get it. Nobody will claim or will step on it, step up. Well, we have this meeting tomorrow because of a complaint of several community members, and we have to go and talk to the chief, and as a result, we got this meeting. And then some of the police officers, I don't know if they were worried, they went to the school where the meeting is going to be at, and kind of set the tone and listen. And then they come to me, like some of the staff members from the school, they're like, do you think the meeting is going to go fine on Wednesday? Because I mean, I really know these people since we were in school. It really made me feel bad. I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that because you know them, they're not racist? Or because you know them since, you're a white person, you have no idea. They treat you well,
So these questions, I believe, are connected and linked as well. How are the police given diverse cultural sensitivity and diverse cultural education in their training? How are stereotypes of police tested, challenged, or ultimately cleansed? And then the other question speaks to, is there customer service training that is public competent?
Well, the big thing we're working on right now is implicit bias, where we are training the entire department on biases they may have that they don't recognize. And that's undergoing this year. Obviously, the biggest area they got to focus on is hiring the right people and bringing the right people in. And a lot of people don't realize that we hire people. There is extensive background tests, background checks. We go to neighbors' homes, we go to ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, we dig, looking to find out what's such a person, as well as extensive psychological testing, where the psychologist looks for red flags, bias, other issues that may be do more training. Our training budget's $120,000 for 850 people. In the world of education, they recommend 2% of your budget should go back to staff development. If that was the case, we'd have a training budget of about $160. So I get asked all the time, we do training on content, we do training on this, we do training on that. I got asked the other day, we do training on how to build barrel cats. I mean, the demands on cops today is enormous, and demands for training is enormous. And we've got a budget for this that we can work. So, but implicit bias training is our priority for this staff.
Final question. I'm gonna ask this of each of the panelists. What ideas do you have for law enforcement and for the community to educate and get to know one another? That we haven't expressed.
Okay. Well, I think that we can kind of build upon some of the things that we did at the barbecue last summer. I thought that was a really, really effective way to begin to start. You know, because we have to also be understanding that as Dr. Berger said, this problem existed with slave codes. So it's been here for 400 years. It's not going to go away in any of our lifetimes. However, we can make every effort to try and have it go away. And how we do that is by building relationships. Every opportunity that we have to build a relationship, we need to make sure that we're taking it. We need to be doing, I hate to rehash it, I know you said but new things, but a lot of what was said tonight are things that I feel will be effective. You know, explaining why you stopped is something that's important. You know, having these officers walk their beats is something that's important. Get out of their car, go walk the beat, make yourself accessible to the neighborhood, particularly in higher crime areas. You know, build relationships. There was one, I think Brandon told me about a situation where he had to turn around because he's actually seen the officer get out of his car, go play basketball in full regalia, you know, play basketball with the kids. You know, he had to turn around and make sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. Those are the types of things that we have to do to try and counteract these things. You know, and then when you have a tense situation, you know, because we have a situation with Ms. Dean, you know, when you have somebody that's a community activist or a community advocate that is just trying to make sure that the citizen is okay. We understand the police want to do a job and get their job done, but we have to be respectful of each other. You know, and respect goes a long way. And there are some officers that unfortunately, you know, don't have a lot of respect for other people. You know, it has nothing to do with what color or race you are. They just are angry people. You know, they need to go get a job working in a stockroom instead of, you know, working with the community. You know, so those are some of the things we can do.
I think we need to start getting going beyond just the Wichita Police Department and bring the other departments aboard and have more conversations with them as well. I believe there's a very fine line between what we call the racial profiling and also the lack of knowledge or information. I'm pretty sure there's still a lot of police officers from any department who still, just like he was mentioning on the study, on the research that he did, where we don't see the human side of the police officer. I think there are a lot of police officers that don't see the human side of undocumented person, of Muslim person. They need to also come and know who we are. They also need to learn who we are. And like I said, I have a lot of coworkers and a lot of friends that they like me a lot, but they still have all these prejudice like, oh, if you're undocumented, you're a criminal. You know, so, and I'm sure there's still a lot of police officers who have their own way of thinking and who watch the news all the time and they get all this, that all the ones that are being deported are criminals and blah, 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 blah. They need to listen to our stories. We need to bring aboard more departments, not only the Wichita Police Department, not only the Sheriff Department, but everybody. I will even dare to have, like I said, ICE immigration in this, because you also need to know who they are and how they treat us. And they also need to be held accountable, because like I said, they're outside in our streets and it's affecting our community.
I would say just a few things. Openness and transparency, definitely. Much of which is going on under Chief Ramsey. Officers coming out, not only the neighborhood associations, but like Juan said, getting out of cars, talking to people, building that relationship on a first name basis. One of the more powerful things I've seen is my wife in the back who's not paying attention, having Captain Germany, Captain Germany, Deputy Chief Salcido, and Officer Moore, and actually, I think Lieutenant Moore now, and Captain Moore, and another gentleman, all in a room talking about their experiences, not only officers, but officers of color, and that they're still human. And having those types of conversations, I think, goes a long way. Again, building those personal relationships. It also helps when Captain Germany, if he'll buy everybody a steak, that would definitely go a long way to making us feel better.
So there's no doubt we have a lot of work to do within the police department, but I'll tell you, I'm very proud of men and women in the police department. Almost 75% of them have a 4-year degree. They work very hard. I think where we have, maybe in the past, where we need to pay more attention than I am, is understanding discretion, understanding the impact of tickets on the communities they serve, understanding how the cock of their head, the raise of their eyebrow, the tone of their voice can impact those people that they serve. But also, they know that relationships are the direction we're heading, and that they have to be part of that. And I always say it takes two to have a relationship. So we like to be invited to community events, neighborhood events where you want an officer to show up and meet them when there's not a crisis. Get to know the officers in your neighborhood by inviting them to neighborhood events, church events, family events, block events. We like to be invited to those.
Thank you. We're inviting you now that on April 9th. This coming Sunday, actually, we've to everybody really, stand beside you, which is holding in the parking lot outside, weather permitting, and if it's not weather, it'll be inside, feeding the hungry, the neighbors, and the refugees. All that, whoever can come, just come on out. So we're invited. Captain? It's Sunday, 11 to 4, this coming Sunday. Yes, ma'am. For the well, this time sir, it's going. The one's going to be cheeseburgers. Just to really do what would help, I think, Chief Ramsey, and I know we put it all on probably on the shoulders of the police, but also sometimes, and very little probably our citizens sometimes take the extra step. But that's not it. What I want to say is social media is so big right now. Which the police department, you said you have hundreds of thousands of videos that the police department takes for police officers. You should really post some of those that are, I'm sure they do nice things, with those videos. Go ahead and put that on social media, your Facebook, channel. All you have there is the like only media stuff. If you have some instances, how many people watch cops on TV? So the same thing. We communicate with you through that, at least know that they're normal people. And I will also commit to that when we all go to the river, here it's coming up, Riverfest. We see the police department there on the horses, and you're walking the streets, you see everybody talking. Because they're right there alone with the public and the community. They're not really looking for a certain person or policing, so I think that helps a lot. Thank you.
And before we close, Dr. Berger, the 2 comments, social interaction and communication. Your report has been informative, and it has given us a foundation for the accomplishment of some of those things. Do you have closing comments for us with regard to your next steps?
Yeah, I just want to say this is work that I continue. These studies are one snapshot in time. The world is constructed, it changes all of the time. I'm not one of those persons that deals a lot with quantitative numbers. It's the world's fixed and that's it. And the world changes, our interactions changes. So, I think, and I agree with everyone on this panel, the human element, the interaction is so important, and I don't think that's superficial or symbolic whatsoever. That would be counter to everything we know about effective community policing strategies. That is instrumental, and I think that could really change the way people feel about each other.
to our community champions, you in the audience, and to you, our panel. I thank you for your time this evening. I thank you for what you're doing to advocate on behalf of our Wichita community, making it the best that we can be. And I'm hopeful that they will stay around for a bit. So if you have a question that has not been addressed, feel free and speak with our panelists after we close. Thank you again for your time.